I'd like to introduce to you David Shasha. He's an independent scholar of Jewish history and culture and the founder and director of the Center for Sephardic Heritage in Brooklyn, New York. He has received his bachelor from New York University and his master's from Cornell, and has written and lectured widely on issues dealing with Sephardic Jewish history and culture. The Center for Sephardic Heritage is a grassroots organization created to preserve, promote, and disseminate issues relevant to the Sephardic Jewish community. The Center for Sephardic Heritage holds lectures and programs for the Sephardic and general communities that expose the rich heritage of the Sephardim. The Center for Sephardic Heritage publishes a weekly newsletter, the Sephardic Heritage Update, with news and reviews of issues relevant to an understanding of the Sephardic community, which is how David is with us tonight, because I am a recipient of that newsletter and I enjoy reading it. And I thought that it would be a great idea to have David here. And when I said I was at ICAR, he said, "Oh, you must know Richard Rubenstein." I said, "Of course, I've had class with him." So that's how we're here tonight. We'll get started. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you for coming. I'm a little winded. I just drove in from Brooklyn. But I'm happy to be with you. I'm happy to be at ICAR. I'm sorry that my two friends in ICAR are not here, Richard Rubenstein, as Carolyn mentioned, and also Joe Montville, who I've known for many years. But it's a thrill to be here, and I hope that that we'll have a decent interaction. I believe the interaction has already begun. But I'm going to have a paper that I'm going to be reading, and I'm going to be speaking along with the paper, so please hold questions to the end. If you possibly can. The title of the lecture, as was indicated by the beautiful poster that was outside when you walked into the building, is called "Contested Histories and Disembodied Voices: How to Speak of the Arab Jew." And the essay will be basically a recapitulation of a tremendous amount of scholarship, and I've met some of the books that are mentioned in the piece from Brooklyn so that you can see them and get some idea of what this is all about. Because again, as the title of the piece indicates, this is all very contested area. It's stuff particularly with what you're dealing with in the dialogue community, in the interfaith community, in the peace community. This is something that is tremendously problematic. And hopefully, after you hear my presentation, you'll get some indication as to why it is problematic. The history of African Americans, the ultimate paradigm when determining the way in which people struggle for their civil rights, is generally left uncontested. The basic contours of that history, from enslavement to release to social oppression to the emergence of rights after decades of struggle, is founded on a substantial amount of archival research on documents and on the eyewitness testimony of slaves, of those who were witness to Jim Crow lynchings and those who marched to protest the conditions of the African Americans, raising their voices as one to achieve the desired goal of civic equality with those who had once turned them into beings less than fully human. By contrast, the history of the Arab Jews is deeply contested. There is not a single point that is agreed upon in this history, and the points of disagreement find themselves deeply mired in the current conflict between Zionism and the indigenous Arab world. This becomes now even more complicated because of who the Arab Jews are today. A book that's just been published by Rachel Shabby is called "We Look Like the Enemy," which goes through a lot of the history. This piece was prepared prior. This book just came out a couple of months ago. And the history is run through in about 200 pages. And in the last section, she becomes extremely despondent and depressed because all these people that I'm going to be talking about, the actual Jews who come from these countries, are among the most vociferous voices on the right. And it would appear that they would not be very good examples of, dialogue oriented individuals. The very term Arab Jew is the first site of contention. How can we call Jews by the moniker Arab when the Arab world has been at war with Israel, proclaimed without reflection as the state of the Jews, and when the Jews who once lived in the Arab world have been spirited away from their nativity and taught by Zionist orthodoxy that their sojourn in the Middle East was one that kept them from living a complete life. The term Arab Jew is one that is the very foundation of the contestation of the history of Jews who once lived in the Arab world. This is forgotten. Everybody forgets that Jews lived in the Arab world. That Jews, in fact, if you open a newspaper from the Middle East or from Israel today, you'll see issues going on with Yemenite Jewry because there was a murder a couple of months ago and a trial and things that are going on. We tend to forget these things. We tend to forget that Jews actually lived in the Arab world. With the exception of the Jews who continue to live in Morocco, the robust, if modest, communities of Jews native to the Arab world have ceased to exist. In Iraq, there are 3 old people. In Egypt, there are 4 old people. In Yemen, there's 100 people, and it's a very contested area because there is a group of Hasidic Jews called Satmar, who are anti-Zionist, who during the communist period in Yemen were able to come through with their anti-Zionism into Yemen, and they've kind of colonized that community. And the Yemenite Jews who are there today, who are kind of in danger because of what's been going on with this murder, don't want to leave. It's a story that's evolving as we speak. The history of these communities has generally been filtered through the mechanisms of the Zionist worldview, which claims at its core 2 important points. 1, Zionism has sought to negate the whole of diaspora Jewish history. It's a very, very significant point. In Hebrew, the term is Shelilat HaGalut, and the basic idea is what happened in 70 AD CE was determinative. The Jewish people ceased to function normally after 70, after the Second Temple was destroyed. That period of time between 70 and 1948, for the purposes of Orthodox Zionist history, is irrelevant. It's irrelevant because Jews do not control their own destiny. The Hebrew term has become a constant refrain in Zionist and Israeli thinking, most recently being bandied about by the novelist Abi Yehoshua, who has repeated the claim that one can only be a Jew in the land of Israel. Yehoshua's claim is that even if you follow all the Jewish commandments in Buffalo or in Arlington or in Shanghai or wherever, you could eat a ham sandwich on the Day of Atonement in Jerusalem and you're a better Jew or more authentic Jew than those people who are following the Jewish scripture and mitzvot and commandments and principles outside of the land of Israel. The Jewish diaspora in this context is a place where Jews lived abnormal lives, and even as they function as a link in the chain that connects Jewish history back to its pre-70 Common Era phase, when Jewish territorial life still existed, that diaspora existence is viewed as an abnormal state. The point here is that how can you have a whole in a history from 70 to 1948, during that period of time, what happens? It's just a complete and total blank. And from a rational point of view, that becomes very, very difficult. Second point, the Jews who lived in the Middle East, outside the orbit of Europe and its modernity, have been viewed as primitives and as lacking in refinement and culture. For those familiar with the work of Edward Said, this dovetails with that. And in point of fact, one of the writers that I'll be quoting from, Ella Shohat, wrote an article called Zionism, the Said article was called Zionism from the vantage point of its victims. Her article was called Zionism from the standpoint of its Jewish victims. As you can imagine, Ella Shohat is not well liked within the Jewish community because of these critiques that she's made. In addition, these Arab Jews, pejoratively known in Israel as Mizrahim, which is a term that translates the English word Oriental. So when you hear the term Mizrahi, which a lot of these scholars will use, some of the scholars like Ella Shohat and the Sephardi radicals will use this term as they're taking on the pejorative term and trying to use it and redefine it. These Mizrahim, Orientals, represent an uncomfortable link to the current enemies of the Jewish state. How then do we speak of Arab Jews, and who should do the speaking? For many decades, the Arab Jews have remained an oppressed community in Israel, and there's tremendous amounts of information in the Shabby book, in the Shenhav book that I'll be quoting from, that provide the numbers and how much people earn. And we just had a presentation at City University last week by Sami Shalom Shitrit, who's also a member of this small group of intellectuals, Sephardic intellectuals, stating that tenured professors in Israel, 99.5% Ashkenazi. And that includes Arab, Muslim, Arab, Christian as well. 99.5 is the number. A disconnect was created between those Arab Jews who successfully immigrated to Western countries, who generally prospered. They've done studies on this. A Moroccan family that went to Israel, and a Moroccan family, a portion of the family that went to Israel, and a portion of the family that went to Paris, the attainment levels are completely different. And those who were airlifted to Israel to become impoverished immigrants living in tent cities and newly built border towns. A very important point is when the Arab Jews came to Israel from their countries, their native countries, they were put on the border. They were dotted along where the Palestinian recidivism would be taking place. That's another reason for the difficulty that these people have in terms of the Palestinian case, because of their being in such close proximity and being utilized in this way. So they lived in tent cities and newly built border towns that put them in places of relative danger and trapped them in lives of futility and abject poverty. These Arab Jews found themselves, after 1948, unwelcome interlopers in an Arab world which had become acclimated to the Zionist argument that all Jews were Zionists. There was, on both ends, from the Ashkenazi, Zionist, Israeli end, there was this idea that Jews did not belong in the Arab world. Hence, they were going to become acculturated to the Europeanized Israel. And in the Arab world, you also had a lapse of memory, a forgetting of the fact that Jews, this is a two-way street, as we have it. After many centuries of living productively in their places of home like Fez, Cairo, Isfahan, Aleppo, Baghdad, Tripoli, and Beirut, the Arab Jews had found their fate manipulated by others who claimed to speak in their names. They were essentially powerless to be able to do anything about it. Such a shifting of fate and voice bore great and awful consequences for the Arab Jewish communities. These communities had first been fractured by the emergence of European colonialism, which used the tactic of divide and rule in the Middle East. The imperial powers played various religious and ethnic cards in order to suppress indigenous unrest, and the Jews of the region were used as pawns to wedge Arab Muslims into a subservient status. So Jews were able to acculturate and acclimate into the French system, into the British system, along with an elite cadre within the Arab Muslim and Arab Christian communities. Interestingly enough, Edward Said, who I mentioned earlier, was part of the Arab Christian community coming from Palestine into Egypt, where he was part of that Europeanized community. There was no real consistency in the European approach, but many Jews began to identify with the Europeans and started to drift from their Arab cultural identity. Such was the beginning of a colonial process engendered by imperialism that found a home in the emergence of the Zionist movement at just the same time as the Europeans came to settle in the Middle East. And this would not save anyone. In other words, if you became acculturated in Morocco or in Tunisia to French culture, if you landed in Israel as opposed to landing in France, this would not save you. People who were living hand to mouth for many decades in Israel could speak 12 languages. They would be selling, razor blades in the central bus station in Tel Aviv. Thus, the long history of Jewish life in the Arab Islamic world was beginning to come to an end. To move back a little bit. This history, now deeply contested, has been most successfully reconstructed in the many studies of the German Jewish scholar S.D. Goithein. For those unfamiliar, I didn't lug down the whole set. This is 5 books plus an index It's basically an encyclopedia of life in the Jewish communities of the Arab world. It comes from documents, I will go through this, from the Cairo Geniza, from a place in the synagogue where scraps of paper were thrown away. Anything, according to Jewish law, anything with Hebrew writing on it has to be buried into the ground. In Cairo, what they did in the synagogue there, it was a huge synagogue, what they did was they put it in a box, and climatic conditions were very favorable for these documents, and they survived many, many centuries. And what Goitein did, and interestingly not able to do it in Israel, he ended up in Princeton, where a scholar today named Mark Cohen is continuing his work in this thing, the Cairo Geniza documents. And Goitein essentially reconstructed the entire civilization, every jot and tittle of the civilization in these books. It's a fascinating thing. Very few people, unfortunately, know about it. In this book, The Mediterranean Society, Goitein provided a sharply defined portrait of the Jewish communities of the Middle East that drew from a textual archive known as the Cairo Geniza. Geniza being a Hebrew term that signified the place where unwanted scraps of paper with Hebrew writing were sent for storage according to Jewish law. The tens of thousands of texts found in the Geniza permitted Goitein to reconstruct with an amazing fluidity and vibrancy the intimate world of the Arab Jews. From sociology to intellectual culture, the Geniza text provided Goitein with the raw material that enabled him to write what, without exaggeration, remains the most accurate and in-depth portrait of a historical pre-modern Jewish community that we currently possess. Interestingly enough, Arabic scholars utilize the material from the Geniza as well, because there is no archive like it in the Arab Muslim world. So things that appear in the Geniza in terms of customs of the community, lifestyle choices, things like this. There are elements about women doing business, things like this. You simply don't have a documentary trail as rich as the Cairo Geniza. The world of the Cairo Geniza, as presented by S.D. Goitein, became the starting off point for the seminal studies of Amiel Alcalay. Amiel Alcalay today teaches at Queens College and the City University of New York Graduate Center. And he is one of the leaders in this field of Sephardi progressive studies. Alcalay's foundational work, After Jews and Arabs Remaking Levantine Culture, published in 1993, drew from both Goitein as well as from the new studies of Arab Jewish culture and history that remained outside the Zionist consensus. Even with the reconfiguration of Arab Jewish history under the harsh yoke of Zionist ideological prejudice, based on a deeply Ashkenazi sensibility, a few texts emerge over the years to tell elements of the story. One, Ella Shochat, who I've already mentioned, hitherto a student and scholar of Israeli film. Her book, Israeli Cinema, was based on her dissertation and does a standard reading of the history of movies, films in Israel, but it takes a particularly Sephardic approach in its analysis. She published a lengthy essay that I mentioned before in 1988 called Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Jewish Victims, the title adapted from a chapter in Edward Said's book, The Question of Palestine. Shochat's article was the first salvo in a battle that fought the Zionist misappropriation of Arab Jewish history and marked a frontal assault on the ways in which Zionism had sought to oppress and demean the Arab Jews. Second, the English publication in 1990 of a book originally written in Arabic and published in Cairo by the Iraqi-born G.N. Giladi. And here's the book. It's out of print in England. It was never published in this country. Discord in Zion, conflict between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews in Israel, was a prolonged cri de coeur that combined historical polemics and social protest into a work that looked to comprehensively tell the Arab-Jewish story from a native perspective, from the perspective of the victim rather than from the oppressor. The Israeli journalist Tom Segev, I didn't bring his book. Segev is, I believe, very, very well known within people studying modern Israeli history, modern Zionist history. Devoted a full chapter of his classic book, 1949, The First Israelis, published in Hebrew in 1984 and translated into English in 1986, to the Sephardic problem in Israel. Segev was the first mainstream writer to discuss the issue of the Ma'barot, the transit camps populated mainly by Arab Jews. The controversy over the Yemenite babies scandal was I don't know if I go over it, but the Yemenite children, which is still a major issue among the Arab Jewish communities in Israel, Yemenite mothers delivered in the hospital were given, after a few days, death certificates for their children without bodies. And it has been a whispered truism within the Sephardic community that these children were taken and sold on the black market. New York Times did a report back in the 80s about this, but there has been no resolution of the matter after a number of inquiries in Israel. So you have the scandal of the Yemenite babies and the scientific racism espoused by mainstream Israeli academics and journalists. Many of the quotes that continue to be recycled were originally first in Segev's book, 1949. Segev's recounting of this racism was shocking proof of a concerted effort made in Israel to stigmatize the Arab Jews in a way that served to justify their persecution at the hands of an elite Ashkenazi cadre. After many years of relative silence and the suppression of the Arab Jewish voice, the few exceptions being the indefatigable Eliyahu El-Yashar. He's an individual who's really not very well known, even in Israel. But he was involved in Israeli politics and the political scene for many years and was the president of the Vad Ha'edah Sepharadi, the Sephardic community in Jerusalem. So you have Eliyahu El-Yashar, a trickle of literary texts from writers like Samir Nakash, who's better known in the Arab world than in the Israeli and Jewish world, because he was the last Arab Jew to continue writing in Arabic, while rejecting any attempt to write his books in Hebrew. Shimon Balas, he writes in Hebrew today, and originally wrote in Arabic, who wrote the first novel on the period of the transit camp's intensities, and Sami Michael. Michael is probably the best known of these writers. He has gone into the Israeli mainstream literary society, all of whom were intent on preserving, to various degrees, the authentic voices of the Arab Jewish community. There was now a place to go to read of the Sephardic catastrophe in the wake of 1948. But by and large, the efforts of these writers, activists, and journalists fell on deaf ears, and this is a significant point. In the midst of the emergence of what have become known as the new historians and the post-Zionists, Sephardic voices were muted and often neglected. If you look at the major representatives of what's called the new history, the revisionist Zionism, the post-Zionism in Israel, you'll very rarely find discussion of these issues that I'm relating to you tonight. In the work of people like Benny Morris or Ilan Pape, you have very little material. In Morris, none at all. So it's something, as you ferret through these books, it's something that you need to think about. Official acknowledgement of anti-Sephardi prejudice was subsumed under what would become the standard Zionist standby. The Jews are one nation, and there should not be any individual claims by what would term the ethnic communities to tear asunder that unity. Quite often, this argument is repeated to anyone who attempts to set out the actual history of Zionism as it relates to the Sephardic world. While this one nation myth is propounded, the Arab Jewish past, once articulated so powerfully by Goitain, has been co-opted by scholars of the school of Sephardi hater Bernard Lewis. Lewis, in his book, the book that came out right after 9/11, called What Went Wrong, actually has a passage that makes this absolutely crystal clear, where he states there are two traditions fighting in Israel for supremacy. One is what he calls the Judeo-Christian, the other is what he calls the Judeo-Islamic. He says the future safety and well-being of Israel depends on the ascendancy, the victory of the Judeo-Christian tradition, meaning the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition. What's interesting about Lewis is that Lewis has spent his whole career as an Arabist, and as an Arabist, having an important substrate of his work being in what he calls the Jews of Islam. That was the title of his famous book. Now, he has a school that has come out of him. And the foremost proponent of his school is a person named Norman Stillman, who has published a number of studies and anthologies on this specific topic. So this school has served to reinforce views that were once the provenance of the so-called Jerusalem School of Historiography, led by Ben-Sion Dinur and Yitzchak Beer. Those names are very, very important for the purposes of Sephardic studies, because going back into what's called the Jerusalem School is an antipathy towards the Sephardic tradition going back into the Middle Ages. There are two models that these men articulated, specifically Baer, who wrote the book that's used, I think, most often, called The History of Jews in Christian Spain, where he shows that the Jews in Christian Spain were weak because they converted. The Jews living in Germany and France in the Rhineland committed acts of martyrdom that was much more in keeping with their ideas about Zionism, about Jewish nationalism. Dinur was best known for his drafting of the Israel State Education Law of 1952, which, a mere 4 years after the establishment of the country, served to lay down the template from which the Jewish past was to be understood. As we have said, the Jewish past would have to be revisited and rethought against the patterns that had been established by the German Jewish historians of the Wissenschaft or Jewish Enlightenment of the 19th century. The German Jewish Enlightenment utilized the old Sephardic model as a way for Jews to become acculturated into a non-Jewish milieu, into a more modern milieu. They looked to Spain and to the scholars and rabbis of Spain to say, this is how we're going to approach German culture. Zionism was, to a certain extent, a reversal of those ideas, and the school of Lewis, I recall going to a conference at Georgetown a few years ago, where one of the adherents of this school, a woman named Jane Gerber, basically made a speech attacking Heinrich Gretz, the great Jewish historian of the German Jewish Enlightenment, for being a sap, thinking that the Sephardic Jewish experience was constitutive of anything positive in any way. She basically presented the history of the Sephardic Jews as being something extremely negative, that the Jews in Spain were persecuted, and all of this interfaith utopia is a myth. So, this revisionist Jewish history, disfigured in the name of Zionism, and its new nationalist and anti-diaspora focus, played down the continuity and Jewish normalcy in favor of what the great Jewish historian Salo Baron called the lachrymose version of this history. Again, it's indicative that Salo Baron, like S.D. Goitein, was outside of Israel. Baron was professor of Jewish history at Columbia University, while Goitein was at Princeton. Within Israel, there was a consensus. You could not say such a thing, that there was a lachrymose conception of Jewish history, because the Jewish history in Israel was an Ashkenazi history. The Sephardic history was whited out. In the works of Dinur and Baer, and subsequently Lewis and Stillman as applied to Arab Jews, diaspora Jewish history was an unremittingly and unrelentingly bleak string of pogroms and persecutions. The Jewish expulsion from Israel in 70 CE was incredibly redated to the time of the Arab conquest rather than the Roman period, 70, as had been the case for many centuries. The reason for the redating and the revision of this history was to assert the cognitive paradigms that were now taking shape within Zionist thinking. This is to make the Arabs into the penultimate enemy of the Jewish people. If you go back into Jewish history, there are certainly other enemies, the Romans being an enemy, the Spanish being an enemy, the Germans being an enemy. But here, everything had to focus on the Arabs. So if the destruction of the temple and Jewish emasculation, the deterritorialization of Judaism took place under the Arabic rule in Palestine, then that would be something that could be pointed to as, well, we're taking the country back after you took it from us. Lewis's role in this process cannot be underestimated. As is now fairly well known, Lewis served British and U.S. political interests during the long and lonely years of the Cold War as an expert in Middle Eastern history. Even during the Bush administration, I don't know what we have today in the new administration, but Lewis was always a welcome face in the White House. Lewis served the Western political establishment dutifully, providing it with an understanding of the Middle East based on an East-West binarism that promoted the idea of a triumphalist imperial West which would control and dominate the resources of a decadent and enfeebled East that would remain at the tender mercies of the post-war imperial powers. People think that Sam Huntington's thesis, The Clash of Civilizations, was Sam Huntington's. It was Lewis's. Lewis wrote the original article called The Clash of Civilizations. Lewis sought to turn back the clock on Arab independence and reinstate new mechanisms of domination and control in the Arab world, leading to a conundrum which remains a source of continual irritation and violence to this day. That I don't think I need to explain. Israeli history is therefore based on these Ashkenazi Zionist myths, meaning this blanking out, this whiting out of an extensive period of Jewish history, that have implicated the Arab Jews within a vast labyrinth of socio-political complexity that served to separate the emerging Jewish state from the geopolitical realities of the region in which it proudly stood as an alien accretion. That is, of course, the paradox. Paradox is that this is a country that does not see itself as a part of its very own region. It's extremely uncomfortable with it. And the people who come from that region represent as well an irritant in terms of reminding them that we come from this region. And later on in the paper, we'll see exactly how this plays itself out in very interesting ways. It is therefore quite clear that the assertion of a native Arab Jewish voice, like that of the writers and scholars we have mentioned above, writers who have sought to disentangle the stories of Jews native to the Arab world, Jews who saw themselves as culturally Arab from the new Zionist mythologies, would become controversial and disputed by the mainstream. So now we finally get to the centerpiece of my presentation, which is a reading of a book by a scholar of sociology at Tel Aviv University named Yehuda Shenhav. And I don't know if this book is known or not known. It's known to the readers of my newsletter. It's called The Arab Jews, a Post-Colonial Reading of Nationalism, Religion, and Ethnicity. Shenhav, professor of sociology at Tel Aviv University, tells the story of the Arab Jews in a carefully modulated academic voice that Edward Said has promoted as the subaltern revolt in academic discourse. Eschewing the heatedly polemical style of writers like G.N. Giladi, Shenhav has written a brilliant book that adheres to the strict protocols of sociological discourse, with arguments that have been carefully documented and footnoted. His voice is that of a modern academic who has broken into the system and articulated a position, or a series of positions, that serves to respond directly to the endemic racism of the institutional Israeli academic discourse that was once modulated to portray Arab Jews as inferior and culturally backward. There are echoes of what happened within the African American community in terms of people like W.E.B. Du Bois. We just have the news, sad news of John Hope Franklin's death, of black scholars coming into the academy and being able to articulate their voices within that. Shenhav's book, at this late date, is one of the first by an Israeli academic, a person who actually teaches in an Israeli university, taking on this particular subject. The structure of Shenhav's book is deceptively simple, yet quite effective. Taking a microcosmic approach rather than a macrocosmic approach to his subject, he doesn't take an overarching view and a history of the period. He zeroes in on a number of items. So he frames the book around two intertwined historical markers, which he investigates in great detail. Unearthing a hitherto obscure and unknown episode in Zionist history relating to colonial Zionist activity in Abadan, a city at the cusp of the Iraqi and Iranian worlds, Shenhav is able to reconstruct the ways in which Zionism first approached the reality of Arab Jewry. This is pre-state. After this examination, Shenhav goes on to discuss the internal Sephardi discourse regarding its history and how that history functions within the larger context of the Arab-Israeli conflagration. The book opens with a fascinating anecdote which tells of the internal contradictions of the Arab Jew. This is a personal story on his part. Shenhav relates the odd tale of his father and his father's role in the Zionist usurpation of Arab Jewish memory. After the death of his father, whose name was Eliyahu Shahrabani, one of the things that Arab Jews coming to Israel, they change their names. So you have Shahrabani becoming Shenhav. Shenhav is approached by a mysterious man who came to tell Yehuda about his father's role in the Israeli intelligence services. As they're sitting Shiva, this guy comes to him and tells him about his father. And this is a quotation from the book. When my father was 17, he moved with a group of Iraqi-born friends to Kibbutz Be'eri, on the ruins of the Arab village of Nahbir. In that same year, Avshalom Shmueli, a recruitment officer, came to Be'eri and recruited them into Israel's intelligence community. There is nothing surprising about this. They were part of an inexhaustible reservoir of ambitious young people, loyal to the state, spoke perfect Arabic, and looked like Arabs. They had the ideal profile. As an intelligence man, my father worked hard and was sometimes gone for lengthy periods. His absence enhanced my status as a boy in the neighborhood. By working for the state against the Arab enemy, he earned his entry ticket into Israeliness. I was able to benefit from it vicariously. But this does not mean I was comfortable with his Arabness, playing on both sides. On the one hand, being an Arab, being able to enter into that world as a spy or as an intelligence officer is very, very valuable because you can extract information. But when you go back into the larger society of Israel, it becomes a problem. As a kid, I fought against my parents and their culture. This is, again, very common. Employing creative tactics, I would shut the radio off or put it out of commission when they wanted to listen to the great Arab singers Kulthum, Farid al-Atrash, or Abdul Wahab. The truth is that I was greatly preoccupied with my own and my family's Arab Jewish origins, but kept the subject to myself. Those origins did not provide a valid entry ticket to become an equal member of Israeli society with its basically Orientalist mentality then as now." Unquote. In the course of telling this anecdote, Shenhav has quite knowingly laid out the richly complex thematic layers of his book. The dense interstitial patterns of this Israeli identity are shown to be formed out of a paradoxical relationship between the need to retain and make use of Arabic culture and language, but in a way that serves to negate that culture. Another quote. "It may seem eminently reasonable for the new Jewish state to use its immigrants' Arab backgrounds as expertise and the basis for a career. As such, my use of Israel spies to argue that the incorporation of the Arab Jews into the Jewish collective was complex and internally contradictory may seem facile. But first, though Arab Jews were routinely used as spies, their cultural skills were never used to forge positive links with Arab countries. This disjuncture suggests that the state was after more than just practical help. Its practices were used to separate Arab Jews from their Arab backgrounds." Unquote. The interconnectedness between the intrinsic Zionist need for insiders who could pass as the enemy and a rejection of the culture of that enemy serves as the fulcrum upon which Shenhav's study turns. Israeli nationalism, which had generally sought to use the Arab Jews for strategic purposes, for instance to populate border regions as a bulwark against Palestinian recidivism, after it was clear that Western Jews were not going to immigrate en masse to the fledgling country, was required to maintain a mutually exclusive and contradictory position. Arab Jews were needed to populate and serve the new country, often using their historical and cultural memory. But those very traits were marked as part of the enemy culture that Israel was hell-bent on eradicating. For a young man like Shenhav, as it was for so many young Arab Jews who grew up in an environment where Arab culture represented not merely the world of the enemy, but that of an unappealing backwardness and incompetence, the process of de-Arabization was a socio-cultural mechanism that had been stitched into the very fabric of the nascent Israeli psyche. The attempt to restore the actual history of this Arab-Jewish world would thus be an assault on the very cognitive socio-cultural mechanisms that served to make up Israeli culture, which was Ashkenazi in both substance and form. The meeting of Ashkenazi Zionist emissaries with Arab Jews was one that took place under the guise of the colonial and imperial encounter. The charge of colonialism against the Zionist movement has been one that is deeply contested by the Zionists themselves. Claim is that they were not colonialists. The question is, are you looking in the right place for the colonialism? Since the Arab Jews are essentially whited out, you're not going to be able to find them, because that's who they colonized. They ignored the Arab Muslims and Arab Christians. They didn't colonize them. They just moved them out. Averring that they were not settler clients of an imperial power, the Zionists have consistently sought to mark their relationship to Great Britain as one which bristled with conflict and constant tension. But the reality was far more complex, as Shenhav points out. Quote, Solel Boneh, that's the name of the Zionist company devoted to building and construction, very important in the early years of the state, began to undertake external work in 1936. Again, this is 12 years prior to the founding of the state. A year after the company was reestablished, and by 1945, again 3 years before the founding of the state, it employed 7,000 people outside Palestine. Beginning in the late 1930s, and more especially during the war years, Solel Boneh grew and expanded under British auspices, operating in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, and Cyprus. The company's collaboration with the British Army landed it contracts to build military bases airfields, oil facilities, and roads, unquote. Shenhav explains that it was becoming clear that as Zionism expanded in the region, the adoption of a non-Arab element would prove beneficial to imperial interests. The Abadan context, and that is the starting off point in his book, is this meeting between Zionist emissaries and native Jews in Abadan, provided a perfect example of the ways in which the colonial world functioned. Quote, "Indeed, on the ground, in their day-to-day lives, emissaries were all aware of the social divisions and hierarchies dictated by color and ethno-racial differences produced by the colonial situation. They could not help but be aware of them. Everywhere they looked, these divisions were ingrained into the fabric of their existence in Abadan, from their segregated whites-only neighborhoods to their privileged working conditions and positions of authority." Again, these are the employees of the Solel Boneh. These are emissaries coming from Israel to do business and are treated differently than the native Jews of the region. The emissaries who had arrived as Zionists came to identify themselves also and even mainly as white Europeans. Those who had not arrived in Abadan, already in possession of a colonial consciousness, had ample opportunity to develop one on site. The emissaries' description of their day-to-day lives and an analysis of their point of view makes it possible to bring in their voices and create a history from below of the colonial experience, unquote. This process was therefore not intrinsic to the situation. In other words, they could have done "we're Jews, you're Jews," and treat the native Jews with equanimity, but they elected to go colonial. What it did was to reinforce the Eurocentric elements inherent to Zionist thinking and build upon those ideas a new socio-political reality that fused the Zionist theoretical ideality, Zionism being a Jewish national movement, that was now fused with colonial realities. And how did this affect the Jews who were native to the region? Quote, "In the Zionist context, the question of the encounter between European Jews and Arab Jews becomes complicated because the encounter, which creates the otherness, does not end there, but also seeks to recruit the other into its ranks. It was here that the European emissaries in Abadan positioned themselves vis-à-vis the Arab Jews and tried to define them as other Arab, yet also one of us, Jewish proto-Zionists. It is just here, in the interstices between the two categories, that the politics of difference lies. The interesting thing is that Zionism, like other colonial enterprises, created a politics of belonging and of difference, and spoke in a number of voices, yet at the same time declined to acknowledge the cultural ambivalence of its own creation and attempted to unfold it within closed binary distinctions. It was a clear case of Jewish Orientalism, where one Jewish group Orientalized the other," unquote. Shenhav lays out a series of detailed statements by the emissaries, those Zionist functionaries who, under the cover of the Solel Boneh project, because they came in with this business deal, Zionist emissaries were trying to bring native Jews into Israel. So they looked to proselytize the native Jews and exhort them to immigrate to Palestine. In the course of this subterfuge, the emissaries were forced to hide their actual identities in order to fool those Arab Jews who they were preaching the Zionist message to. This is what's interesting, is that each of the emissaries had to take on a new identity, because one of the differences between the Zionist cadre and the native Jewish cadre was that the native Jews were by and large traditional. They respected religious authority, they were by and large observant of Jewish law, and the Zionist leadership was, of course, completely secularized. So they had to now present themselves in pseudo-religious terms in order to trick the native Jews in this project. Their innate contempt for the Zionist Jews, for the Arab Jews, was barely concealed. In the words of Enzo Sereni, one of the European Zionist emissaries, quote, this is a quote from Sereni, who was an emissary, "This material is not European material," referring to the native Jews in Abadan, on the worksite. "It is material that is quick to become enthusiastic, but also quick to despair, unable to keep a secret, unable to keep their word. There are deep waters, and those waters are not bad, but there is foam on the water, and it is bad, of an Arab Levantine sort. Assimilation from a Levantine type into a culture that does not yet exist or is at a nadir. They can be turned into human beings, this is from his writing, but we shall not be able to accomplish that without the help of the people in the land, meaning the land of Israel. And even more pointedly, another quote, their whole life is in cafes, again referring to the indigenous Jews of the region. There is no family culture. When you hear this, there is a very, very famous Israeli movie from the early 1960s called Salach Shabati, and it's almost word for word a description of what goes on in that movie. The man is not to be found with his wife and children, but sits in the cafe and plays at towle, backgammon, or cards for hours on end. In every corner are brothels and arak, hard liquor. There are clubs of the rich that are frequented by wealthy families. This is a center of matchmaking and gossip, but if they want a good time, they go to a cafe. The theater has no culture. The talent develops according to the needs of the audience. This culture is largely that of Jews. It is total assimilation in the Orient. So again, we have to pinch ourselves we have to realize that this is a Jew not speaking about an Arab Muslim or an Arab Christian, is speaking about an Arab Jew. Such racist stereotyping chillingly recalls not merely the many examples of Ashkenazi racism, such as what I just mentioned, and I apologize, I'm going over stuff twice, such as the late Ephraim Kishon's execrable Salach Shabati, but even more pointedly, the now standard arguments presented by Edward Said as a response to Lord Cromer in his classic book Orientalism. This is a quote from Edward Said. Orientals or Arabs are thereafter shown to be gullible, devoid of energy or initiative, much given to fulsome flattery, intrigue, cunning, and unkindness to animals. Orientals cannot walk on either a road or pavement. Their disordered minds fail to understand what the European grasps immediately, that roads and pavements are made for walking. Orientals are inveterate liars. They are lethargic and suspicious, and in everything oppose the clarity, directness, and nobility of the Anglo-Saxon race. Cromer makes no effort to conceal that Orientals for him were always and only the human material he governed in British colonies. Again, the quotes from Cromer, the quotes from Enzo Sereni are rather the same. Said's description and analysis of Cromer's words can easily be fitted to those of Enzo Sereni, the Zionist emissary to Abadan. Native Jews are presented as pathological and deficient. Their rehabilitation can only be effected with the help of the people of the land. The land here, meaning those Ashkenazi Zionist settlers in Palestine. The categories developed by Said in his Orientalism are thus operative in the encounter between Ashkenazi Zionists and Arab Jews in Abadan. What is even more startling is the degree of subterfuge that was undertaken in the process of trying to brainwash the Arab Jews to leave Iraq and Iran and come to Palestine. And this was one of the things that really shocked me the most. Sadly, the subterfuge implicates the figure of the revered Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was one of the more important rabbis in the Zionist Yeshuv, who, as a hardened Zionist fighting his own internal battles against the Orthodox anti-Zionist Ashkenazi establishment, provided cover to emissaries like Sereni, who required a new identity to be able, in order to be permitted access to the Arab Jewish communities. And this is what he did. He conferred on the emissaries, all atheists, the traditional character of what we call in Hebrew shaliach. That's a person who goes on a religious trip to collect money for a religious institution. These shalichim, Shanhav calls them shadarim, concealed their true identities under the guise, ironically, of religious emissaries, empowered to persuade the local Jews to come to Zion, not for secular or nationalist reasons, but for religious ones. In other words, these Zionist emissaries, all of whom were not religious and had no knowledge of religion and no sympathy for religion, all end up wearing yarmulkes and going down and telling them God wants you to come and all of this religious sort of business. Cook, in this case, supplies letters to these emissaries, providing them with the necessary cover. Cook knew the subterfuge. He knew that he was sending people to do a certain job who were not what they appeared to be. Not a very good thing for a rabbi. In a letter written in 1932 for the emissary to Yemen, Shmuel Yavneeli, a completely non-religious Jew, we see the rabbi state the following. This is a quote from Cook. This is what he gave along to the emissary. The bearer of this letter, who was visiting your country, is the important dignitary and sage, Mr. Eliezer ben Yosef. Gave him a new name. This dear man was in the Holy Land for many years, and he has information about the customs of all our brethren, may they live. The Hebrew reads in a way that any religious Jew would be able to see a confluence with a normative religious discourse. It's meant to have the people in Yemen say, wow, this is the rabbi is telling us that this is a holy man, and he wants us to come for holy purposes. We have entrusted him with matters to investigate and to inquire about from the high and honorable sages, in order that we may also allow the communities of Yemenites who are gathering among us to follow their own customs. Everything is, the circle is squared. The Yemenites are to be made comfortable. These emissaries are to be seen as religious figures. The whole thing, of course, is one huge subterfuge. Such a transformation of Jewish praxis and its cognitive realities led to an undermining of the traditional customs and beliefs of the Arab Jews, and ultimately led to a fusion of Jewish praxis with the Zionist imperatives that have served the state of Israel quite well through the years. Essentially what happened was, the Jews, native Arab Jews who come from this region, many ended up losing their religiosity. As a side point, if you look at Sephardic religiosity today, it's a major bone of contention because you have the Shas party. If you look closely at the Shas party in Israel, they all look like Ashkenazim. They all wear black hats, and they're all extremists, and they all yell. This is not the Sephardic tradition. The Sephardic tradition, which is not the purpose of this presentation, I'm happy to take questions about it, but the Sephardic tradition is much more scholastic, much more intellectually oriented than what you have in the Ashkenazi Orthodox community. The second half of the Arab Jews discusses the complex ways in which Arab Jewish history has intersected with that of the Palestinian Arabs. Again, something that's not really that well known, because you have the issue of refugees. In other words, Arab Jews left their countries. Would they be considered refugees, and how? Evoking the highly charged and often utilized argument that in 1948 a population exchange occurred between Arab Jews and Palestinian Arabs, the issue of reparations and repatriation of refugees in peace discussions between Israel and the Arabs would take on a quite expansive dimension in the perpetuation of the conflict and the ideological polemics that continue to swirl around it like bees around a hive. I mean, this torpedoed many negotiations. Arab Jews were put upon by the Zionists, and we'll see this in a moment, to present a case that we are like the Palestinians. So the Palestinians, when they come to the table, well, look, this is what happened to Jews. So that sort of thing is very, very important. But in reality, and this is something that Shenhav has made very, very clear, there is no organic connection between what happened to Arab Jews and Palestinian Arabs. In spite of the fact that Zionists sought to lure Arab Jews to Israel, the Arab Jews, by and large, did not heed their call and elected to remain in their lands of origin. We look at the situation in Abadan. All of the subterfuge proves that they really didn't want to come. They had to be hoodwinked into coming. Indeed, a number of Arab Jews who came to Israel in its first years looked to return back to the Arab world. And we have examples of this in the book. Mistreatment of Arab Jews took a number of different forms, from the forced settlement intensities in immigration camps to their increased dependency on the organs and institutions of the Mapai labor establishment. Arab Jews were caught in a lethal web of an almost absolute reliance on a venally paternalistic Ashkenazi hegemony. And here I'll give you a quote from G.N. Giladi's book, Discord in Zion. Quote, Sephardi Jews suffered from harsh health conditions in the camps with each family, usually with many children, living in one tent whose area was smaller than a normal room. In 1950-51, the winter was unusually harsh with snowfalls everywhere. The tents and the huts had no heat, and since there were only a few standpipes in every camp, people had to stand in long queues for their water ration. In rural areas, priority was given to the Ashkenazi farmers, and the camps had their water cut off. Often the water was muddy and unfit for drinking, which led to an increase in complaints and violent demonstrations against the authorities, which were put down with a steel hand. There was one shower with cold water naturally for every 16 people, but it was rare to find a shower which worked regularly. The toilets consisted of a small pit measuring 1 meter square. and there was one for every 4 families. The queues to use them were long, and sometimes there was only one per 100 people. After heavy rainfall, the contents of the pits would overflow, and in summer they gave off a foul stink and nourished armies of stinging insects. The government did not bother about rubbish removal, and, since the camps had no gutters, mounds of rubbish piled up. Since some of the camps lay on the Lod-Tel Aviv highway, Ashkenazi journalists wrote that these camps were jeopardizing Israel's image, since they could be seen by foreign tourists, and it would be better to move them away from the highway. The establishment thus started building cement huts of a few kilometers away and demanded that the camp inhabitants buy them and move into them. The Sephardim, however, spurned this offer because there was no asphalt road from the new location to the highway. But the Ashkenazi newspapers picked this up and reported, quote, "These Sephardim refuse to live in buildings because they are used to living in tents like the Bedouin," unquote. A crucial aspect of the contestation of Arab-Jewish history lies in the fact that Giladi's text itself has become a part of the debate. Notwithstanding the many Sephardim who have presented such stories, which are well known in our communities, the official Israeli version of the history of this period has largely erased the Arab-Jewish voice, suppressing instances of institutional oppression such as the Yemenite baby scandal and the ringworm children scandal, which continue to remain mysteries even after many vain attempts to have them adjudicated within the Israeli justice system. The government of Moshe Sharet took the step of linking the fate of the Arab Jews to the Palestinian Arabs. Quote from Shemel. The Israeli government's creation of the linked property account was a singular act, something of a historic milestone, that constructed a zero-sum equation between the Jews of the Arab countries and the Palestinians in Israel. The political theory that underlay the Israeli government's construction of that equation rested on a system of moral, diplomatic, and economic assumptions that resulted in a practice of nationalization and naturalization that was riddled with contradictions. The government of Israel automatically assumed that the Jewish ethnicity of the Iraqi Jews meant that they harbored a Zionist orientation. In other words, you could have a refugee only if you have the situation, the Palestinians are refugees because they want Palestine. For an Iraqi Jew to demand reparation, he would have to want to be an Israeli. It endowed them de facto with that particular form of national identity before they had any intention of immigrating to Israel, and certainly without having obtained their consent, unquote. This linkage would forever mark the ways in which this subject will be discussed and contested by all sides of the equation. Palestinians would continue to fight the linkage, as what happened to the Jews in Iraq or elsewhere in the Arab world had nothing to do with them asserting their claims to compensation for property that was taken from them by the Zionists. Arab Jews would argue that they were not a single monolithic group that could be represented exclusively by Israel. Who would get the money? If the Arab countries were to pay reparations, who would be getting these monies? The Arab Jews themselves, and would diaspora Arab Jews be entitled to this money? In addition, up to that time, the Arab Jews had more or less been fleeced by Ashkenazi Zionism, as we saw in the Abadan situation, and had become the de facto underclass of the state. Monies going into the coffers of the government had little impact on the actual day-to-day existence of so many Arab Jews whose poverty and lack of social standing would become more of a problem as time went on. Should I go to the end, or should we start taking questions?
We can start taking questions.
Because it's an hour. I don't want to go on. So we'll just end it abruptly at that point, and we'll begin the discussion, because I'm hoping that this will have elicited a lot of